Okay, so chapter 26, we're going to talk about economic growth and what helps cause economic growth, what can make economic growth faster, why some countries are poor, why other countries are rich, and how some other countries catch up. Okay, so economic growth is often described as an increase in overall real GDP. Remember, real GDP. Again, we're looking strictly at the um, output that a country produced. Nominal GDP, we're looking at current year prices, current year quantities. Real GDP, we're using a base year price, so that way we can just track how much the economy produces in goods and services only year after year. So it's an increase in real GDP or real GDP per capita, and as mentioned back in chapter 24, this is real GDP per capita is real GDP divided by the population, and that is what we use to determine the standard of living. Okay. And oftentimes it's calculated as a percent. So, for example, it can be we grew 2% this year compared to last year. And, we have what we call the rule of 70. It's a very quick rule. You divide 70 by the annual percentage rate of growth, and you will not put this in decimal form, you'll keep it as a percent. So for example, if the annual percentage rate of growth is 2%, then you will divide 70 by 2 and get 35. So the amount of years approximately that it will take to double real GDP will be 35. So obviously the higher the percentage rate of growth is, then the faster real GDP will double. Right, so growth in U.S. real GDP between 1950 and 2012, it increased about 3.1% a year average, so that's more than sixfold. Real GDP per capita, more than threefold, so about 2% a year. Okay, and so some of the benefits here is, we've had improved products and services. We've also had added leisure time, meaning we work less hours in this time period than we did. The average work week used to be about 50 hours, even 6 days a week. Now it's fallen to 5 days a week, 35 hours. Of course, this doesn't include overtime. There are some other impacts from growth that we'll talk about a little bit further on in the chapter, but it's not always, there's always some kind of trade-off, and so some people are concerned about the environment and scarce resources running out and pollution from economic growth. All right, so we see here in 1950, real GDP was about 2 trillion. Our population was 152 million, so you can see from 1950 to 2012, our population has doubled, more than doubled. Okay, real GDP per capita was, and this is column 2 divided by column 3 to get that. So the average person made about $14,000 a year, $14,500 a year. And if we fast forward to 2012, we see that the average person made about $50,000 a year. So our standard of living has definitely improved. We have produced more goods and services, and our real GDP per capita has also increased significantly. The other way you can look at real GDP per capita is, the average income as well. Okay, so this began with the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. This can be traced to the steam engine. The steam engine helped power ships, locomotives, and also factory equipment. So factories were able to mass produce goods. And this basically shifted from goods being hand produced by local craftsmen. It would take a lot more time. And with the factories, the goods were being able to produce at a much faster rate. a much more even rate. The quality control is a little bit easier in that regard, and also at a more efficient cost. This resulted in increases in living standards. Then, more income per person. When companies do more, they can pay the workers more, and living standards also increase. And as we've continued to develop, and as technology has continued to increase, and new technologies being discovered and implemented, and faster technology, this has led us to be more productive with our work time. So we work less hours, as I mentioned before, and so there's more time for leisure. There's also social change. Women are now more in the workforce. There's also been new labor laws in. The human lifespan has doubled, as we also have more technology when it comes to medicine and better access to healthcare in that regard. Usually, higher GDP per capita is associated with better healthcare and more access to healthcare, and therefore longer living standards. And also, economic growth has also led countries to move towards democracy. As companies begin to implement this new technology, they wanted regulations abolished. Feudalism has been abolished as well. People started to have more of a voice. Okay. So this originally began in Britain and then has, spread to other parts of Europe, mainly Western Europe, and then it came to the United States. So one reason you could say that, Western Europe and the U.S. is much richer than other countries is because their industrial revolution began sooner. But it is possible for other countries to catch up through the catch-up effect. So leader countries can invent technology. So, U.S. invented the computer. We have the invention of the steam engine. In Britain, and follower countries will adopt this technology and acquire the capital needed, and also change the governmental system to allow, for less regulation and opportunities to grow, and then they start growing at high rates. We can see this for right now, like in Brazil and China, who have the last few years have had high growth rates. And as they become saturated with more of the capital and infrastructure and roads, then eventually their growth rates will slow down and be more like developed countries, such as the U.S., where our average growth rate is 2-3% a year, whereas China in the past years has had 7, 8, 9, 10% growth through the catch-up effect. But eventually, as they become a developed country, their growth rates will level off as well. Okay, so we can look here. So I want to point a little bit to South Korea here to demonstrate a little bit of the catch-up effect. Okay, so South Korea in 1960, their average income per person, real GDP per capita, was just about $1,800. And if you look at the United States, it was almost $15,000. Okay. However, when we go to 2010, United States was $41,000, but South Korea was at $26,000, almost $27,000 per person. So you can see that their income has increased considerably, and they are a perfect example of the catch-up effect, where in 1960, they didn't really have a lot of capital or infrastructure, and then throughout that time period, they began to acquire capital, infrastructure investment, and their growth has been quite significant, and their income levels are catching up to that of developed countries. So, for example, look at South Korea in 2010 at 26,609, and then look at other countries that that are developed, such as over here, France, Japan. Okay, you can see that South Korea's real GDP per capita is not much lower than these other countries. Okay, and so their growth rates were also higher, and that's an example of the catch-up effect, where the poorer countries' growth rates are higher as soon as they start acquiring capital and developing their infrastructure, etc., than richer countries who in 1960, the U.S. already had a lot of capital goods, a lot of infrastructure, so the growth rate was not as high. The example I always use is, let's say your job was to write memos all day. Okay, you were to produce memos and you had a pen and paper. Okay. Let's say you wrote maybe 6 memos a day. Okay. And then all of a sudden you were given a computer and trained how to use the computer, and you went from writing 6 memos a day to 100 memos a day. That's a significant increase in productivity. And then let's say you get a faster computer. So you go from writing 100 memos a day to 110 memos a day. There's still an increase in productivity, but not as high. So South Korea, let's say, had pen and paper, and then they were given a computer, so the growth rate was really high. The U.S. in 1960 already had a computer, but they've just upgraded their computer, so their growth rate is just not quite as high. Okay, and you can see modern economic growth starting from 1820 all the way to 1998. And on the vertical axis, you see GDP per capita in 1990. This is all adjusted for U.S. dollars, and U.S. growth has just been outstanding. Extremely high growth rates, extremely rapid increase in living standards as well. We can see Japan, which is the blue line, also has experienced high growth rates, and Europe. Now we've seen other regions not experiencing such great growth rates, such as Africa. There's different reasons for this. A lot of Asia, that excludes Japan, and also Latin America too. Okay, so what do we need to have set up in order to be able to grow? Okay, first thing is strong property rights. People need to be able to own land and have that land protected in order to start enterprises, in order to start business. If I wanted to open up my business, but I lived in a country where, let's say, it took me 10 years to even get a patent, as it did at one time in Haiti, okay, or I can own land, but it's not well protected by the government. Let's say my neighbor arsons my business, and they pay off the courts, and they don't get prosecuted, and I lose everything. Okay, there's not good insurance systems, etc. There is no incentive to own land in order to start your own business. Without strong property rights, it is not very efficient. It's not. There's just no incentive, rather, to own land to start your own business. You will just be spending just as much time and resources protecting your land, rather than using that time and resources in growing your business. Also, patent and copyrights. You have a great new idea, for example, and this is actually ties in with property rights, because a patent is protecting your intellectual idea. If you have an idea, you need to be able to protect it and not have it stolen or infringed upon. Also, efficient financial institutions. We need to be able to have transparent and open banks that we can borrow from, that are honest, that are not going to swindle us. This was partly what shook up the U.S. During the Great Recession, during the crisis in 0809, is these financial institutions were going under, and for a time period there was a number of Americans that were increasing how much cash they have on hand. They kind of were a little scared to put money in banks, but the U.S. does have regulations in place and reform regulations, and also we have federal deposit insurance. Your money's protected up to a certain amount per bank, and that helps people keep money in the banks. Literacy and widespread education. So in the U.S., we're required to go to school until we're 18. Okay. But in other countries, this is not so. There is no requirement. So people don't even learn how to read or write, or they learn how to read or write but not do basic math. I mean, they stop going to school after 5th, 6th grade. And, the more knowledge we have, the more productive we tend to be. It would be hard to do our jobs if we did not know how to read or write or do basic math. So, and also in the US, we have community colleges, 4-year institutions, and we have loans and, trying to make it available to people. And so the more educated a country is, the more productive they are. Free trade. We have seen that countries that have allowed free trade have grown at faster rates than countries that tend to be a little bit more isolationist or closed off. Free trade, it's not only that helps us with goods and services, but it also helps the transfer of ideas as well. In a competitive market system, prices send a lot of information, and it helps companies know how much to produce. It sets the demand for consumers. With a competitive market system, there's information being spread apart from the consumer to the producer very efficiently. We don't need the government to tell, for example, Nike how many shoes to produce. We do that through the price system and through consumer demand. Okay. Some determinants of growth, natural resources. Okay, so a country does not necessarily need a natural resource to be a rich country. If you look at Japan, they don't have a lot of natural resources, but yet they still do well. But it definitely helps. I mean, there's some countries like Saudi Arabia that have the income they do because they are very dependent on natural resources such as oil as well. So the more natural resources we have, then the more opportunities there are that we can use these natural resources and produce, not so much produce them, but sell them, and that will help for our economic growth. Human resources. Okay, so this is essentially the amount of education and skills and training that a country's population has. The more education they have, the more skills, the more training they possess, then the more productive they will be. So they will produce more per hour than if they did not possess that level of education or training skills. And also how much capital goods a country has. The more machines and factories, for example, or back in the 1700s, the more steam engines a country had, then the more they were able to produce. And the more we're able to produce, the more we sell, and the higher the incomes we have. And also improvements in technology as well. We're learning how to make current technology faster, more efficient, and less costly. There's also the demand factors, and overall consumer demand has been increasing as our real GDP per capita rises, our income rises, we demand more goods and services. And also the efficiency factor. We must be able to use our resources and our time and our labor efficiently. Okay, so let's look a little bit about the production possibility frontier. Okay, so the production possibility frontier helps illustrate the fact that we have scarce resources, and it also illustrates trade-off economic growth. Okay, so we have capital goods on the y-axis, vertical axis, and consumer goods on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis. Okay, so this is what economic growth does to the production possibility frontier. Okay, so let's say in 1950 we start where the red curve is. I'm sorry that it's not very straight, but essentially we're only able to produce X amount of capital goods and Y amount of consumer goods, but as the economy grows, then we can produce more of both. So now, because of better education training and an increase in technology and an increase in capital goods, we're able to shift the production possibility frontier outward and able to acquire both more of consumer goods and capital goods. Okay, so we have here real GDP. Okay, we have labor inputs, basically meaning how many hours we work, multiplied by how much we produce per hour. Okay, and looking a little bit deeper, what determines labor inputs? It's two things. It's size of the employed labor force. Okay, so the U.S. has a large portion of their labor force. Of the population that is employed. It's actually one of the reasons why the U.S. has the highest GDP in the world, and we also work more than the average person around the world. We don't work necessarily the most, but we work more hours than a lot of our counterparts, such as France. All right, so those two together determine labor inputs, and then labor productivity, what makes us productive. And once again is advances in technology. We now have faster technology at our fingertips. Our computers have become a lot more efficient and fast. Our phones alone are like a mini computer. A lot of times we do a lot of our work from our phone. Quantity of capital. Okay, so how much capital do we have at our disposal? Our education, training, skill set, allocative efficiency, which essentially is when labor is able to be reallocated from industries that aren't so efficient to more efficient industries. And that happens when there's a flexible labor force. Okay, so how much of our GDP growth, was due to increase in the quantity of labor versus in the increase in labor productivity? And we can see that increase in labor productivity is more of the determining factor. Quantity of labor, our population has kind of stabilized now. The average woman is now having 2.1, 2.2 kids in the U.S. So we're just barely replacing our population we're growing our population, but it's just a very small amount of growth. Whereas a lot of the increase in GDP has actually been due to increase in labor productivity, increases in technology, increases in education and skills training in the workforce, increase in the accumulation of capital goods, etc. Okay, so breaking down productivity, 40% of our increase in productivity is due to technological advances. 30% will be an increase in the quantity of capital. 15% is due to education and training. And then economies of scale and resource allocation makes up the other 15%. Okay, so economies of scale is when we're able to produce at a lower cost per unit, and this results from an increase in output levels. If I were to buy a big printing press to only produce, let's say, one book, that cost per book would be very high. But the more books I produce, then the cost then drops per book. Okay, so normally as firms increase their size, they're able to use better equipment, larger equipment that's better suited for mass production, and so this will increase their productivity and lower their costs. Improved resource allocation is when we move from lower productivity jobs to higher productivity jobs. So the U.S. at one point was very most jobs were in agriculture. And over time, they shifted to manufacturing, and now we are much more of a service oriented economy. So a lot of us are teachers, accountants, consultants, lawyers, doctors, and therefore our productivity has increased because of this. All right, so we can see here, and this is definitely a concern for a lot of economists, as Nicholas Kristof said, the country that out-educates us today will outperform us tomorrow. And you can see that, especially in terms of math and science, really the STEM fields, the United States has been lagging a little bit. Mathematics, we're 9 out of 10. And in science, we're 10 out of 10. And so, this is something we're looking at and trying to see, what these countries do differently and what the U.S. can do to help improve these scores. So you can see from 73 to 95, average rate of growth was 1.5% a year. However, there is a big jump from 95 to 2012. And if you attributed this due to the introduction of, for example, the internet, the computer, then you are correct. Okay, this definitely helped increase productivity significantly. And of course, again, the more we produce, the more companies make, the more they pay their employees, and living standards rise. So, looking more at the increase in technology, so the microchip, it is the microchip that allows us to have our computers, whether it's personal laptops, tablets, business computers, barcode scanners, pocket calculators, and even now, some of you might have noticed when you're at the checkout counter, our credit cards have a little microchip in them that we can pay with now instead of sliding as well. It's also helped us with develop radars and digital cameras and just all sorts of applications that we can attribute to the microchip. So there's been a lot of startup firms, and though a significant number of these firms end up not making it, a lot of them do, and they have increasing returns. So we can look at Apple, for example, and Google's. Okay, there was, especially Apple at one point was such a small company and declining, and it's been turned around. You pretty much have to be living under a rock to not know Apple, and they have increasing returns, which means the amount of inputs that the firm puts in leads to an even greater output as well. And sometimes they can use these returns to invest back in the company and keep research and developing newer and better, faster technologies. Higher output helps companies spread out their developmental costs. It costs a lot of money to develop a new software, but the more they produce of it, then the less that cost is per unit that they produce. Also, it helps lead to more specialized inputs. Okay, so workers can focus on one sole aspect of the job versus and become really good at it versus trying to do everything at once. So the more a company grows, then the more they can hire people that specialize in just one area versus trying to have a small company where 3 people are trying to do it all. And we have simultaneous consumption, that these products can service customers all at the same time. Okay, so ebooks, for example, I can buy an ebook the same time you can buy an ebook, for example. Any type of video game, DVD, software program, etc. Network effects, software. Okay, this is very beneficial to us. If we all, for example, have internet, then we can send messages to each other. We could do work even though we're not necessarily in the same area over there. Also, this goes to phones and tablet computers, etc. It helps us become more productive. And also learning by doing. So, they're developing a new software, but as they continue to develop, and firms then really learn the new technology, then they become more efficient and faster at it. And also with global competition, instead of firms competing just within the US, firms are competing worldwide. It's not only the US that has technology companies, it's also other countries, firms in other countries worldwide, and they're all competing with each other for the same consumer. Technology and the internet has really allowed the world to become much smaller. So if we were just limited to the US, let's say there's 10 software companies, but since it's an open market and we trade, it's really more like, if you include foreign software companies, 20 or 30 software companies that are competing against each other, and that leads to pressure for lower prices and faster technology and new developments. All right, so we can see from 73 to 95, average productivity was about 1.5%. Okay, but from 95 to 2012, it was 2.4%. So you can kind of see here in 95, we have like the tech boom that started over here and helped increase productivity. All right, so there's definitely some questions. Is this desirable? Does it necessarily lead to more happiness? And is it sustainable as well? So there is a contingent that, is very anti-growth. They say that there's a disastrous effect on environmental, and it's on the environment, and also stretches our natural resources very thin. They are not necessarily wrong. There have been trade-offs, and there have been damaging effects to the environment, and we definitely have to look at conserving our resources for future generations. However, those in defense of economic growth, say that over time there have been improvements in using resources more efficiently. And also, we've been this has also driven us to look at renewable energy and alternative energy sources as well. Become more environmentally conscious, we recycle more. So, we won't necessarily run out of our natural resources. We'll just find more efficient ways to use them. And also they argue that, economic growth leads to a higher standard of living, more leisure time, and more access to healthcare and longer lifespans. Okay, and this is pretty much what I just expanded on my last point already. Okay, the Global Competitiveness Index, as you can see here, it measures where it uses factors such as innovativeness, how innovative is a country, how capable are they to transfer technology among different sectors, efficiency of a financial system, rates of investment, and the degree of integration with the rest of the world. So basically, overall, this will measure a country's ability to achieve economic growth over time. And I know sometimes people are surprised to see that the U.S. is not number one. In fact, it's number 7. So we have Switzerland, that's number 1. I think we all know that the Swiss have the most complex financial system in the whole world. Singapore is number 2, followed by Finland, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, and then we have United States, United Kingdom, Hong Kong, and Japan. Okay. So we see that as economies grow, they go from being agricultural based to manufacturing based and then to services based. And what we do see here too is women join the labor force. Women also go to school more, therefore they delay marriage, they delay having babies, and they don't have as many babies, so fertility rates fall. Because of there's there's a decrease in population, and a lot of these countries like Japan, their generations are getting smaller and smaller, and so it creates a problem that if the labor force is smaller, can economic growth continue to happen, and also there's a concern that a lot of resources will be used to take care of the large older generation as well. There's also the inverse dependency ratio that can be looked at. And this is the number of people working between the ages of 20 to 64 divided by the number of dependents. And this is seniors over 65 and youths under age 20. And so we look at this because we see that what we need is worker productivity will have to rise in order to compensate for the relative decline in the number of workers as compared to dependents. Okay, we need productivity to keep going up. Since population is slowly decreasing, then future generations have to become more and more productive in order to keep real GDP growing. Because remember, part of real GDP growth is the size of the labor force. More people that are working, the more that is being produced. So if the real labor force is declining, then productivity has to compensate for that decline. Also, we worry about, Social Security. The way it is right now is, we won't probably see Social Security benefits in our lifetime right now for under 40. We're paying into it, but we might not receive it. And also innovation and productivity. So essentially, the more people that there are, then the more chances there are that you'll have new innovators and scientists and entrepreneurs. And so as population declines and we have less scientists and innovators and entrepreneurs and people that discover new technologies. So these are just some of the concerns about population decline that, and these are raising very interesting questions, and policymakers need to get together to discuss possible solutions, or even to create incentives for people to have more kids. Anyways, this concludes chapter 26. I hope you all have a good day, or morning, evening, afternoon, night, and I will see you all in chapter 27.